In the early hours of April 26, 1986, inside a massive concrete building at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in Soviet Ukraine, a group of engineers prepared to conduct what was supposed to be a routine safety experiment on reactor number 4. Unaware that a combination of design flaws, procedural violations, and mounting pressure to complete the test would soon trigger one of the worst technological disasters in human history. The reactor they were operating was an RBMK design, a powerful Soviet nuclear reactor capable of generating enormous amounts of electricity, but also known among specialists for having unstable characteristics under certain conditions, particularly when operating at low power levels where small mistakes could rapidly escalate into uncontrollable reactions. Earlier that evening, the reactor's output had dropped far below the level required for the test, forcing the operators to withdraw most of the control rods that normally regulated the nuclear reaction. And by the time the experiment was ready to begin, the reactor was already operating far outside the safe parameters its designers had originally intended. At 1:23 in the morning, the test finally began as the engineers shut off the turbines that powered the cooling pumps, hoping to measure whether the spinning turbines could still generate enough electricity for a few crucial seconds while backup generators activated during a power failure. But within moments, the unstable reactor surged violently as coolant flow decreased and the nuclear reaction accelerated beyond control. Operators attempted to shut down the reactor by pressing the emergency AZ5 button that was supposed to insert every control rod into the core simultaneously. Yet because of a fatal design flaw in the rods themselves, the shutdown procedure briefly intensified the reaction instead of stopping it, producing a sudden spike in power that exceeded the reactor's limits by an unimaginable margin. The explosion followed almost instantly. The force of the blast tore through the building, launching the 1,000-ton concrete lid of the reactor into the air, while superheated fuel, burning graphite and radioactive debris were hurled across the facility and onto the surrounding rooftops as flames began spreading through the shattered structure. Moments later, a second explosion ripped through the remains of the reactor hall, leaving the nuclear core completely exposed to the open night air, while fragments of intensely radioactive material scattered across the power plant like glowing embers from a fire that no one yet understood. The reactor was gone. Within minutes, firefighters from the nearby city of Pripyat rushed toward the burning power station, responding to what they believed was a routine industrial fire, without any knowledge that the smoke rising above the plant carried lethal radiation invisible to the human eye. Among the first responders was a young firefighter named Vasily Ignatenko, who climbed onto the roof of the reactor building alongside his crew, while pieces of graphite from the nuclear core continued to smoulder around them, some so radioactive that simply standing nearby exposed their bodies to doses of radiation far beyond survivable limits. The firefighters worked through the night, attempting to extinguish the flames that threatened to spread to other reactors, stepping over black fragments scattered across the roof that they assumed were pieces of insulation or machinery, unaware that many of them were actually chunks of nuclear fuel ejected directly from the destroyed core. Several firefighters later recalled seeing a strange blue glow above the reactor ruins, as radiation ionized the surrounding air, creating a ghostly light that flickered against the smoke, drifting into the dark sky above the plant. None of them had protective suits, none of them had radiation meters, and none of them had been told what had actually exploded inside Reactor 4. Inside the nearby city of Pripyat, nearly 50,000 residents slept peacefully as the radioactive plume drifted slowly over apartment blocks, schools and playgrounds, settling silently across the streets while families went about their normal routines the following morning, watching from balconies as a column of smoke continued rising from the power station on the horizon. Children walked to school. The radiation levels were already thousands of times higher than normal. Only 36 hours after the explosion did Soviet authorities finally order the evacuation of the city, dispatching hundreds of buses to transport residents away, while officials announced through loudspeakers that the evacuation would be temporary and that people should bring only essential belongings because they would soon return. They never did. In the days that followed, the Soviet government mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers, engineers, miners, and volunteers known as liquidators to contain the disaster and prevent the exposed reactor from releasing even greater amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Many of these workers were sent onto the reactor roof for less than a minute at a time because radiation levels were so extreme that electronic robots failed almost immediately, forcing human crews to shovel radioactive debris away by hand while knowing that every second they remained there shortened their lives. Helicopters dropped thousands of tons of sand, lead, and boron onto the burning core in an attempt to smother the reaction and contain the radiation escaping into the air. While deep underground, a group of miners dug a massive tunnel beneath the reactor to install a cooling system designed to prevent molten nuclear fuel from melting through the foundation and contaminating the region's groundwater. In the months that followed, a massive concrete structure, known as the sarcophagus, was constructed around the ruins of Reactor 4, sealing the destroyed core inside a tomb of steel and concrete that would eventually be reinforced decades later by an enormous arch-shaped structure called the new safe confinement. Yet even today, far beneath the twisted remains of the reactor building, highly radioactive material from the melted core still lies where it cooled into strange formations of solidified fuel and metal, including a mass known as the elephant's foot that remains so dangerous that prolonged exposure near it can still deliver fatal doses of radiation. The Chernobyl disaster would contaminate vast areas of Europe, force the permanent evacuation of entire towns, and leave behind a radioactive exclusion zone that remains largely uninhabitable nearly 4 decades later. What began as a late-night safety test had instead opened the reactor itself, releasing a force powerful enough to transform a thriving city into an abandoned landscape, where forests now grow through empty streets and apartment buildings stand silent under layers of dust and rust. And deep inside the sealed remains of Reactor 4, the wreckage of that night still exists, hidden behind walls of steel and concrete that were built to contain the consequences of a disaster that changed the history of nuclear power forever.